I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Waddell. I'm a program fellow here at the law school. I'm also a senior attorney with the law firm of Olson, Hagel, and Fishburn in Sacramento, California. My specialty is public pension law. I am the former general counsel of the California State Teachers Retirement System and also the San Diego City Employees Retirement System. At those systems, I did a fair amount of work in governance, and that sort of moved into some of the projects that we'll be talking about this afternoon. What we're going to do, and we're going to try to do it fairly briefly, and my intent is to leave time. Actually, my intent is if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to ask. And if we start running out of time, then we'll take a more disciplined approach. But I'd like this to be an iterative discussion as much as possible. What we're going to do is provide, at the first part of the presentation is going to be providing a context to the need for best practice governance policies for U.S. pension systems. So we're going to talk about the overview of the existing governance structure that applies to most, not all, but most U.S. public pension systems. We talk about board member roles and responsibilities in administering these systems, what the applicable fiduciary duties are, and then one approach to looking at how to make sound board decisions that are consistent with those applicable fiduciary duties. That's going to take us about through the first half of the presentation, and the remaining part of the presentation is going to be talking, basically setting the groundwork for and discussing the Clapman 2.0 report, which hopefully everybody here has a copy of, and if not, they're on the table outside. And for those of you looking at this video later on online, there'll be a link to the report as well available on the same page. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about 3,400 state and local public pension plans in the U.S. that collectively invest and administer about $2.7 trillion in assets. They provide benefits to 28 million members and beneficiaries. I should emphasize that a large number of that 3,400 are very small local systems. There's really probably about 200 or 250 systems in the U.S. of significant size, and by significant size, I mean anything more than 1 billion or 2 billion, something in that range. Board size typically, and there have been surveys on this done by the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. Board sizes typically ranges from 7 to 13 members, and the board construct typically consists of a mix of the following type of members. Some are appointed by the plan sponsor, some are elected from the plan membership, and some serve ex officio, either by virtue of being elected to, or appointed to a public office such as treasurer, controller, those types of offices. Most of these boards meet monthly. Some meet more frequently than that. A very few meet, say, every other month or so. And the boards have a varying reliance on committees. Some make extensive use of committees, others very little. And usually that's a factor of size. If the system's business is simple and not so complex, you'll typically see very few or no committees with a system of that size. But as the systems get bigger and more complex, it becomes unwieldy to deal with all of the issues, you know, at one board meeting. So they typically break the issues off into, for example, investment committees, appeals committees for benefits issues, and the like. Plan governance structures are typically set forth in state or local statute, and that means that change requires either legislative action or a vote of the general electorate, which is the case in California in many instances, i.e. these are very difficult to change in terms of the board construct, the qualifications of members, which are often specified in statute, and the like. All of these meetings, with very few exceptions, such as certain limited matters relating to investments and personnel matters, are conducted in the public. And when I say meeting, I just don't mean meeting as a meeting in a boardroom. Most public access laws provide that if a quorum or more of the members are communicating in any way, either person to person or by electronic means, that also constitutes a meeting. So you can't do that, and that's generally true across the country for most systems. The records of these systems are mostly public, again with exceptions such as personnel records. Some emphasize some instances, investment records, and the like. Board members are typically uncompensated, and they must publicly disclose their personal financial interests, which sometimes includes their client relationships. This is really the ultimate thankless job in many respects. And frequently, in terms of hiring staff to do the work, there are constraints on hiring and compensation of internal staff.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question?
You may, Mr. Kopis.
The third point, bullet point, board members uncompensated and then have to disclose how they're financed. The ultimate thankless job.
Oh, sorry, Rich, can we get a mic over to Rich? I apologize. I'm getting waved at in the back, so.
I'm talking about bullet point number 3, the board's uncompensated and have to disclose all their personal financial, as you called it, the ultimate thankless job. Many of these systems, most of them, are large financial institutions. Is that a good idea to have them uncompensated? I mean, who then ends up running for these boards or is on these boards?
That is a really good question, and I'm going to answer it very briefly because it's going to be hard to plow through the material that we already have. But the short answer is this. Systems that have looked at compensating their board members have run into huge political opposition. So as a very practical matter, we can talk about what makes, the most sense, but there's a very practical political bearing. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. To that kind of change. It's been proposed in some jurisdictions, even here in California, and it's been shot down quickly. Often for the same reason that the bullet point I've got here about constraints on hiring compensation of internal staff. All of this is done in public, and the public has something of antipathy towards paying public employees and public officials anything, let alone what would be considered to be a market rate of compensation. So that's a serious issue. And the other point I'd make on that is that even though it's an ultimate thankless job, I have been impressed. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 15 or 16 years, and I've been impressed by the quality of people that you get on these boards. I mean, and when you think about it, people volunteer on in all kinds of areas, on all kinds of things where they don't get paid, but they think it's important. This is clearly an important area, and for the most part, the main barrier to finding qualified board members has not been the absence of compensation. It's been this issue of disclosure of financial interests. That has been a significant problem, and at more than one system I've been at, it's led to the loss of an otherwise qualified board member for that reason. You'll find a mix of well, again, looking at where they come from. Let's take, obviously, if you're an elected member, you're coming from a given constituency that the pension system covers. The question was, who sits on these boards? So take the appointment, in ex officio is obvious. You're running for an office, and it happens to be once you get that office, then you're also, by virtue of that office, you're sitting on the board. So let's look at the appointed members for a minute. A lot of them have either experience in a given area relating to pensions, they have an interest in finance, they have an interest in pension issues or financial issues generally, or investment issues and the like. You'll see a lot of folks that used to be, for example, at the CalSTRS board. There's a retired ERISA attorney who sits as an appointee of the governor on that board. So you'll see people from those kinds of walks of life on the board. Thanks. Mike, please. Okay, sure.
So who appoints them?
Sorry?
Who appoints these people?
When I use the term appointing, let me go back to the slide. When I use the term who appoints? What? Okay, appointed by the plan sponsor. So it's a mix. It could be the chief executive of the public agency that's the plan sponsor. For example, in the state of California, the governor makes a number of appointments both to the CalSTRS and to the CalPERS board. The legislature, in the case of CalPERS, also has an appointment to that board. There are other jurisdictions where the appointment comes from the governing board, say a board of supervisors of a county or the city council. In some instances, it's the chief executive, the mayor, or the county executive. It really depends, on what the plan documents say. It's a mix. But the common theme, for the most part, is that the people making the appointments clearly have some nexus to the political world in some way, and typically are themselves elected officers. Okay. So why? And I thought a lot about this, and I think, these are some of the possible explanations for why we have a system set up this way. We have a strong tradition of representative democracy in this country, and I think that explains why, at least historically and in the present, we look to folks with a mix of backgrounds and experience representing different constituencies to oversee the administration of these systems. And some of the issues I've talked about with respect to open meetings, open documents, clearly are a feature of, freedom of press that goes obviously back to the Constitution. As a practical matter, there are very large pools of money involved, and that attracts a lot of attention and interest from the public, because anytime you put 9 zeros after a 1 or more, it gets people's attention. And for a lot of these reasons, because there's a number of constituent groups involved, because there's a fair amount of politics involved, as a practical matter, there has been some changes. Some systems have actually managed to, get legislation through that changes their governance structure, but more often than not, they haven't gone anywhere. And I think for our purposes, and when the committee was looking at where we were at and where we want to be, we had to assume that there wasn't going to be a lot of fundamental change in the governance of these organizations from a legal perspective anytime soon, which differentiates us. We get criticized a lot by, when I say we, I mean the U.S. public pension governance structure gets criticized from our friends to the north in Canada. They have a very different model. Well, I think they have a very different model because their political structure is very different. I don't think that we're going to see a wholesale change anytime soon to expert, compensated, highly compensated board members running these systems. And I have my own views on whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, and I think other people have different views, but for purposes of what we're talking about today, it really doesn't matter because that's our world, and that's the world we're trying to address with best practice governance policies. So what does the board do? It's not like the board members are sitting there calculating benefits, making decisions on which stocks to buy, and those day-to-day duties of a pension system. They're basically there to do these things. They're there to establish the strategic direction of the system. They're there to hire the necessary staff and consultants to carry out that direction and administer the system on a day-to-day basis. And they're there to oversee system operations to ensure that the board's direction and systems responsibilities are being fulfilled. Again, they're not the doers. They are the overseers for the most part. But ultimately, the buck stops with them to ensure that sufficient plan assets are available to provide for the prompt and accurate payment of benefits to their existing and future retirees. Basically, it comes down to collecting the money, investing the money, and paying out the money in an accurate fashion. That's the mission. That's what they're supposed to be doing as a system. There are obviously a lot of moving pieces to this. I'm not going to read every item on the list, but you can see that the number of key responsibilities that they have in the course of doing that. I want to segue from what they do as trustees in administering a system to what's the applicable ultimate fiduciary legal structure under which they have to operate. Well, what are they doing? They're under a continuing obligation to ensure that their decisions with respect to plan administration and investment of system assets are fully compliant with their fiduciary duties. And in U.S. law, all trustees are treated equally. You don't get a free pass for your first board meeting if you're making a difficult decision. You're held at the same standard as the most experienced trustee on the board. So that sounds kind of scary. Let's talk about what these legal duties are. Well, two main duties that all people like me talk about when we're talking to pension systems about their fiduciary duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. I'm not going to read the full definition that's up on the screen on the duty of care, but I think it's important to focus on the fact that it really is a focus on the conduct and the extent of investigation. And as we see, as we don't see because I have it somewhere else, we're really talking about procedure, and on the last bit of that bullet point on the last slide, procedural prudence. Have you followed a prudent procedure in making the decision that you're making at the board level? The most fundamental fiduciary duty is the duty of loyalty. And basically, it's very simple. A board member, in one sense, it's very simple. A board member has to place the interests of the system participants above all other interests. They can't harm the interests of system members or beneficiaries by doing any of the following. They can't place their own interests above the interests of the members and beneficiaries, i.e. they can't self-deal. They can't act in the interests of a third party, including the plan sponsor, to the detriment of the members and beneficiaries of the system. Nor can they favor the interests of one group of members and beneficiaries over those of another. And that is a corollary or a part of the duty of loyalty known as the duty of impartiality. I don't see any law students in the room. Oh, you do? Okay. All right. I don't know if you've had trusts, estates, or anything in the fiduciary duty, but you'll get sick of hearing this quote from Justice Cardozo, but this is the classic quote that describes how significant the duty of loyalty is. Yes? Okay. All right. Well, for future reference, if you do have that class, this slide has a definition of punctilio. So when you hear that word again, you can turn to this presentation. It means a minute detail of conduct and observance of a code. So how are trustees supposed to make sound board decisions consistent with these applicable fiduciary duties? Well, not everything, but a large part of what they do involves casting a vote at the end of a discussion on a given item, be it investments, be it a benefits matter, be it whether or not to adopt an actuarial evaluation that will result in a significant increase in the plan sponsor contribution, for example. Well, trustees have to ask themselves some questions before they can cast a vote. At least they should, in order to, prudently and effectively cast their vote. And what are those questions? Well, CalPERS recently asked itself this question, and CalPERS, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, has gone through a very deep examination and restructuring of all of its governance practices and policies, and in addition has spent a lot of time considering what the fiduciary obligation really means. And they attempted to define the questions that should be asked, and I think that these are really good questions. They may not be all of the questions, but it's definitely a good start. They came up with 8 questions, and they are as follows. First goes to, ultimately, is there a sufficient record before the members upon which to base a decision? Again, I'm not going to read the entirety of each question, but that's really the gist of the first question. The second really asks if all of the benefits and risks have been evaluated before the decision is made. The third goes to the question of whether or not any and all reasonable alternatives to the proposed course of action have been identified and analyzed. Fourth, are staff and the outside expert, where there is one, in agreement on the recommended course of action? Now, in technical legalese, if they answer that question is no, then you have a Houston, we have a problem moment. You've got to sort that out. And that's what these sub-bullet points are. But the idea is if you've got 2 people telling you different things, and they're both experts you're relying on, then you have to start thinking about how you're going to sort that out before making a decision. Were any questions that either I as a board member had or others had during the discussion sufficiently answered during that discussion? So as we'll see in a minute, the first 5 questions we just went through really go to the duty of care, the idea of a prudent process. Has everything been asked and answered in an appropriate way before making a decision? And the next 3 go to the duty of loyalty. First, question of conflicts of interest, which goes to the question of self-dealing that we talked about a few minutes ago. The second is really the core duty of loyalty question. Does my intended vote reflect the best interests of the system's members and beneficiaries as a whole, without regard to the interests of any constituency or appointing power responsible for my position as a board member? Now, this isn't a fiduciary law presentation, and so I don't have the slides that I usually use for the idea of 2 hats. But the concept very generally is that even if you come to your board position either because you're appointed by the governor or you're elected by a certain constituency of the membership of the system, your vote needs to reflect the best interests of the members and beneficiaries of the system, not the constituency or appointing power that is the reason that you're on the board in the first place. And lastly, will the results of the board's decision favor the interests of one group of the system's members and beneficiaries over another group? I think that is, in essence, a restatement of the duty of impartiality question that we talked about. Again, first 5 questions relate to the duty of care. Questions 6 through 8 address the duty of loyalty and impartiality. So the core question, and there are a lot of reasons that people have used for why best practice governance policies are important. Some have attempted to measure it in terms of financial performance. Others have attempted to measure it in terms of, well, if we do this, hopefully no one's going to go to jail. But ultimately, it's about satisfying the overall fiduciary duty of the board members who are running the system. How do we place board members in a position to be able to ask and competently and confidently answer these questions? Well, how can best practice governance policies help? They can clarify the roles and responsibilities of board members, staff, and outside consultants, which provides a sound framework for effective decision making. Second, they can define the system's expectations with respect to board member attributes and core competencies. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Related to that is it can establish an educational curriculum designed to help trustees develop and maintain these attributes and core competencies. Now, several of you in the room I know work with or have been on public pension boards, and I think you'd all agree there is no shortage of stuff out there, conferences and the like, that you can go to that cover different areas of interest to public pension systems. But the amount of those presentations that are really directly tied to the kinds of questions that we're talking about here is a much smaller subset of the total amount of presentations and the like that are out there. Lastly, through the adoption of strong conflict of interest and disclosure provisions, you can provide deterrence against bad conduct and rapid recognition and resolution if someone does attempt to engage in that kind of conduct. So that brings us to the original Clapman Report, which was issued in 2007 by the Committee on Fund Governance of the Stanford Institutional Investors Forum, under the leadership of Peter Clapman. Committees consisted of current and former representatives of large public and private investors, as well as academic and corporate governance practitioners. There's a common theme to the sequencing of the reports we're going to talk about. They were inevitably preceded by some series of governance meltdowns at large public or private institutions. And the ones specifically mentioned in the original Clapman Report are the Getty Foundation, the San Diego City Employees Retirement System, which again, because of that meltdown, that's how I happened to leave Cal STRS and go down and help them bail out from that situation, and then the Illinois Teachers Retirement System. The committee members recognized the need for increased fiduciary protections and wanted to head off burdensome regulation. And the premise, going back to my point earlier, is that good governance practices help to ensure better organizational performance, fewer conflicts of interest, a higher probability that goals and objectives will be obtained, and less opportunity for misuse of corporate assets. The original Clapman report set forth a series of best practice principles, and those principles covered 5 areas. First is transparency of rules and governance. The second are a number of principles relating to the structure, selection, and education of fund leadership, including the governing body and executive staff. Third is trustee attributes and core competencies. The fourth, addressing conflicts of interest. And the last one is delegation of duties and allocation of responsibilities among relevant authorities. Now, among the key recommendations in leadership, trustee attributes and core competencies were these. A governing body should consist of appropriately qualified, experienced individuals dedicated to fulfilling their fiduciary duties to fund beneficiaries. Governing body should promote policies that strengthen fiduciary principles in the selection and monitoring of trustees. And trustees must take reasonable steps to acquire the skills to serve appropriately as trustees. Turning to conflicts of interest and related disclosure policies, there are principles relating to the disclosure of potential conflicts of interest, compliance with conflicts, rules, and reporting requirements, and avoidance of undue influence and a reporting mechanism for when it occurred. So what was the impact of this report? It served as a governance benchmark for large institutional investors. If you Google it, you will find that a number of systems, either directly or through consultants, relied on the 7 principles as, in essence, a benchmarking exercise to look at what the system's existing governance practices covered and identified areas that needed to be strengthened or added. But there's some challenges. And these challenges ultimately led to the Clapman 2.0 report, which is this document. Many systems lacked resources for the development of from-scratch governance policies. If you don't have internal staff that has got the time, which is a big issue, or the expertise, which is sometimes an issue, to do this internally, you're going to end up paying a consultant a lot of money, and by a lot of money, frequently north of $100,000, to get going on this kind of project. And for many systems, especially systems that are less than, say, $3 or $4 billion in size, that is a significant amount of money because these systems are basically so tightly budgeted, trying not to spend too much of their investment return on their administrative expenses, because it's drilled into them, as it is with any investor, that administrative expenses are a drag on ultimate performance of the system. Sure.
Small. I mean, when you hear, I didn't realize there were 3,400 state and local plans. That's huge. And you know, what you're talking about here, even for us as a $90 billion system, we work at this all the time. We have a lot of resource. I can't imagine a system, you know, under a couple billion tackling this. So, and I also wonder whether they have political influence to change the overall governance structure that they've been saddled with.
There's 2 different questions in that. The first relating, I'm going to take the second one first, which is the ability to influence the political structure. And again, and this is discussed at some length in the report itself, the prefatory question is to what extent does the independent board involve itself in the political process to try to affect that change? So there's a prefatory question there. And the second question is the one you raised. Even if it makes that decision, to what extent can it be influential? That's one of the many reasons why, again, this report takes the perspective. We're going to assume, for purposes of these recommendations, that we're working off of what we have in terms of the governance structure. Which isn't to say that if you think you have the ability to change things and you think that would be a good idea, you shouldn't pursue it. But in a sense, that's beyond the scope. Now, your question about resources is an interesting one, because I have worked with systems that are of the following size: $300 million, $1 billion, 5 billion, and now I think what's CalSTRS, 180 billion. So a lot of the grunt work, if you will, and Sheen's in the audience, she and I worked together a lot getting the original pay-to-play, placement agent disclosure, those policies in place at CalSTRS, and CalSTRS obviously has the resources to do that. What's interesting to me, and we cite, I think more than once, policies adopted by the Marin County Employees Retirement System, which is a small system. I'm pretty sure it's less than $2 billion. They've got great policies. Now, I think I know why that is. They've got a really smart outside counsel, and they've got staff and a board who are really committed to that process. Even at the $300 million system, we made a lot of improvements. Now, we didn't take, the Clapman 2.0 report and say, okay, let's just do this. But they had an existing set of governance policies, and we went through and, did the important stuff. So the short answer is, and I guess the other part is, I just became the outside general counsel to a $1 billion system, and the plan in the long run is to really start digging into this stuff. So I don't know that it's a question of dollar size. I think there's other factors that play into it. Ann? And that's, what we tried to do with this report is kind of bring what we viewed as the best policies that we could find in these areas. We've got policies from CalSTRS, from Washington State Investment Board, from Colorado PURA, Maryland. We have policies from all over the country. So we've staved, systems, some of the work. I emphasize some of the work in doing that research. But as a practical matter, that raises an important point. This is constantly evolving. I'll bet that if I went online now and looked for a policy in a particular area that we cover in the report, I'd probably find one that's even stronger and better. So one of the common themes, or continuing themes, constant themes in this is that it's an evolving process. You're never done. My successor at the San Diego City Employees Retirement System has a policy revision, addition, update on that system's governance committee agenda, at least one and sometimes 2 or 3 every month. Now, she's really dedicated, and I'm not saying that every system has to approach it in that way, but it's definitely not something, and again, this is stated in the report, this is not something you can do and put it up on the shelf and forget about. Thanks. Where are we? So the Clapman Report was the first report in a progression of 3. I actually was not involved in the drafting of the first Clapman Report, but it was presented in 2007, right after I had become the general counsel at SD-CERS, and it was, in essence, a godsend. It was great. I've got a template. I can go to the board and say, let's start digging in on this stuff. Here's some principles that we can work off of. Well, again, the other answer to your question, Teresa, about why does a system get started? San Diego CERS had no choice. They were as low as you can go in terms of, they'd been battered. There'd been 3 outside investigations. The city was under SEC compliance order, so I got to know the SEC monitor really well during the time that I was at. So that's another motivating factor. And the great thing, what's happened in San Diego is long since I've gone, long since I departed and long since the SEC has departed, they've continued their dedication to keeping that process going. But the next iteration, we're going to talk about the ASME report in a minute. Second report in the trilogy is the ASME 2009 Best Practices Report. And that report, as we'll discuss, took model policy language for the Clapman principles and developed policy language around those principles. And those were in the areas of board member responsibilities and core competencies and conflicts of interest. And lastly, as we'll discuss, the Clapman Report itself, 2.0, contains and sets forth model policy language as well as other governance tools for all 5 Clapman principles. So what prompted the AFSCME report? The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees wanted to enhance the retirement security of their own 1.6, shouldn't be a dollar sign there, 1.6 million members, as well as public employees and retirees generally. Again, the common theme, no good scandal should go unrecognized. At that point in time, pay-to-play was in the East Coast / New York and New Mexico phenomena. It hadn't reached California quite yet. And there was a belief on the part of that organization that enhancing board member core competencies would enhance effective decision-making and that strengthening conflict of interest policies would deter wrongful conduct. And oh, by the way, AFSCME recognized that a lot of our members sit on these boards and they need help and we want to provide it to them. So that was, a goal of the report. What did the report do? Again, we provided model policy language for the Clapman recommendations for board member responsibilities and core competencies, as well as conflict of interest. One of the unique things about the AFSCME report that picked up on work that had been done at CalSTRS and a couple of other systems is it tied the education policy directly to the development of the responsibilities and core competencies. So first, you identify responsibilities and core competencies, then, well, what is it that board members need to know and be able to find out in order to fulfill those, and how can we get them, identify and get them the right education? One very difficult thing, going back to the point about everything being done in public, is it's very hard for a lot of systems to do either individual self-evaluations or board self-evaluation because all of these documents can become public documents, and that obviously serves as a chilling effect. So what we did is we decided rather than solve that legal quagmire, what we did is we provided a simple set of questions, a questionnaire that a board member individually, in the quiet of his or her own home late at night, could answer for themselves and decide based upon those answers, he or she could talk to a staff member, say, I think I really want to focus this year on understanding actuarial principles more. And so how can I get some training on that? Or whatever the subject is. Private equity, like the idea is give the trustee a way to self-identify where they should focus their training efforts. The other thing that the report did was it enhanced the ethics and conflicts of interest policy language in areas such as third-party communications, undue influence, pay-to-play, and placement agent activities. We'll talk about some of those specifics a little more as we get into the Clapman 2.0 report, which is now. Any questions up to this point?
Do these fiduciary duties extend to the way these funds invest their money?
Absolutely.
And in particular, like in front of choices like the one that I think CalPERS had in the past, that is, so we know from research that there are some sectors of the index which are particularly good for returns, like, tobacco and weapons, but not good for society. But if our commitment is to our members, we shouldn't care about these other social needs. So does these fiduciary duties extend to this kind of choices, inform this investment behavior or not?
Yes. And those were, I can't speak to CalPERS, I can speak extensively to CalSTRS because I was the general counsel when they adopted the tobacco divestment policy. And the answer to your question is at that time, there were, CalSTRS did not make the decision to divest based upon social concerns. They didn't do it based upon the idea that tobacco was a bad thing. The record was developed that showed that they were divesting because of a concern that the index holding these stocks represented a significant downside risk to the portfolio. At that time, there were numerous class action lawsuits against tobacco companies, serious threats of regulation against the tobacco industry, and the like. So at the time they made that decision, they were focused on their fiduciary duty. And now, currently, they periodically review that decision under the same criteria to make sure it's still appropriate for them to be divested.
In the UK, for instance, now the government is asking the pension fund to have a strong engagement behavior by the pension funds to the companies they invest in. Is there any, so these fiduciary duties extend to the engagement in the companies, in the corporate governance of the companies you invest in, or
yes.
not?
And again, the underlying fiduciary predicate for much of that engagement is that by definition, especially the larger systems, they have to manage to a large extent by index. They don't have a choice as to whether or not to be in or out of a particular stock. So one way to monitor and hopefully enhance performance as you're holding these stocks, that in one sense you don't have a choice whether or not you hold or not, is to engage and work with the company to try to help them enhance their value. So that's the underlying fiduciary predicate and the reason for why they do that. Sure.
My question is about CalPERS question 2.
Okay.
And CalPERS question 2 dealt with risk and benefits of particular policies, I believe. Mm-hmm. And the question I have is, how or what sort of insight can you provide into the appropriate level of risk that a board is willing to take? And the example I'll use is the issue of the discount rate, one of my favorite issues. Because typically what CalPERS and CalSTRS and most other boards have done is they've said, well, we believe we have a 50-50 chance of meeting this rate of return. Right now, CalPERS and CalSTRS say we think we've got about a 50-50 chance of hitting 7.5%. And the question I have is, if I were saving for my kids' college education, which I've done 3 times now, I wouldn't say, well, I've got a 50-50 chance of meeting my objectives, so that's okay. So the question is, how is risk determined? What sort of what is the acceptable level of risk? And what are your insights into that? And I'm curious as to the Clapman 1 and 2 insights and any others that you know of that assess what that acceptable level of risk is.
Well, any system in evaluating those kinds of questions, again, are looking at a range of options, are relying on the experience, on the advice of experts, and are looking both at what past history has demonstrated as well as what people are saying about the future. So yes, you can find, as an example, one of the criticisms of the discount rate currently is that a lot of people are saying, well, they're not going to make that going forward. One of the things that's drilled into anybody in the investment world is you can't predict the future with any degree of certainty. You have to you're in essence making educated guesses. And the flip side to the argument that there's no way it's going to be, you're going to make that in the future, is that how can we say that with certainty, given that if you look back over more than 10-year periods, that's been, not an unreasonable assumption. And furthermore, how can you make a decision, let's assume that all of a sudden you drop the discount rate to, say, 5%. Your liabilities are going to escalate dramatically. You're going to require a huge increase in employer contributions. And how do you justify that when you have the past performance out there? It becomes much more difficult to justify. I'd love to get into that discussion more deeply, but my 30-second version is that the key from a fiduciary perspective is that the system's got to have all of the available information before it and advice and with people with expertise in the area.
So someone on a board could say, I've met my fiduciary responsibility because I know that we have a 50-50 chance of hitting this target. And to me, that just seems like a really low standard. Again, as a parent saving for my kids' college, I wouldn't accept a 50-50 coin flip opportunity or chance. If I were doing something else, involving that sort of risk, and maybe it's more of a question about the culture of public versus private boards.
Can I answer that?
Sure.
You're dramatically oversimplifying what capital market assumptions do. You're looking at a range of options around a mean. And so you're saying it's flipping a coin. Flipping a coin indicates win or lose. There's gradations around a return. So maybe one year we're going to make 9.5, the next year we're going to make 5. For instance, this year we're probably going to all make 20%. So there's a range of options around that 7.5. So it's not a 50, it's a 50-50 chance above and below it, but it's not like if you get below it, you don't lose. And it's also time sensitive, and you have to pick your period of time. And I think one of the things there's a big difference between how investors think and how mere mortals think. And we are long horizon. So I always say you've got to have a stomach for the interim volatility and be comfortable with it. And I think that's a fiduciary duty, to be long horizon, to have the stomach to handle those interim periods of extreme volatility, and then work very hard to position your portfolio to continue to earn that. And it's hard, believe me. We work very hard at that. But our 10-year return right now is 8.7%. So, even including the worst financial crisis in any of our lives. So, it depends on what your risk is. If your risk is you're going to, because you're afraid of the future, going to automatically lower your discount rate, what you're doing then is putting a huge burden on this current generation to pay more in. And so I think all those things have to be balanced out, and I think that's what a good fiduciary and a good executive of a system does, is raise those issues and balance them out.
We could probably have a discussion.
It could be a whole other hour, which we don't have, but thank you for the question, and thank you for Teresa, much more eloquent than I was able to be. So we are now at the Clapman 2.0 report. It was prompted by several factors. Just a general belief there was an organic need for continuing improvement in system governance for all the reasons we've talked about earlier. There's a desire to refresh the Clapman principles and facilitate their implementation even more broadly, again, specifically targeting systems that may not have had the resources to hire a very expensive consultant or otherwise push on this without some assistance. It was pushed along by two things that happened while we were beginning work on the project. The first is the unprecedented economic and political challenges following the 2008-2009 market meltdown. And the second is more high-profile governance failures, this time with the pay-to-play issue making its way out to California. We reconvened, reconstituted the Committee on Fund Governance with a mix of original and new committee members. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at the governance policies of many U.S. state and local systems. There's a lot of intervening research in the area and also legal action. The GFOA issued best practice recommendations for post-retirement benefit systems in 2010. The SEC issued its final pay-to-play rules, which is, of course, a continuing theme in a number of these governance meltdowns. And we also looked where appropriate to non-U.S. system governance and research where it was available. So essentially what the Clapman report does is it filled out the work that was started in the ASME report, and in the end the Clapman report provides policy language and governance tools for all 5 of the original Clapman principles. The 3 that were not covered in ASME that are covered in Clapman 2.0 are transparency of rules and governing structure, fund leadership, and delegation of duties. We also updated the ASME recommendations in the areas of board member core competencies and education, as well as conflicts of interest. Now, there are several areas I want to briefly highlight from the report, but this is by no means an exclusive list. The first is that there's a lot of focus in the report for clear lines, on the need for clear lines of decision-making authority, focusing specifically on what's the role of the board, what's the role of the board leadership, what's the role of the committees, if you have committees, and what's the role of senior management. should be able, in our view, you should be able to look at a system's governance policies and answer these questions. Who has the final authority to set meeting agendas? That's not always clear. What if someone other than the chair wants to put something on the agenda? Does it just go on the agenda, or does someone have to approve that? What's the scope of issues within a given committee's jurisdiction? Does it have the final authority over the issues before it? And how do committee-discussed items get deliberated and then brought to the board without the board having to rediscuss everything that happened at the committee, so all the board members get a feel for what happened? And again, and perhaps most importantly, which responsibilities have been delegated fully to staff and which have been reserved by the board? It is not always clear what the answer to that question is when you look at a system's governance policies. And when I get asked, where should we start? Whoops. That last bullet point is the answer to that question. You need to identify, under what circumstances can staff make decisions regarding investments, regarding the calculation and payment of benefits, regarding the determinations on member appeals and the like, versus what has to go to the board. And if it goes to the board, is the board the approver? Is the board the reviewer? Are you just keeping the board in the loop? What is the actual function that the board is playing if there is a board role in that decision? One of the things that was an idea actually from one of the members, my successor at San Diego actually, Elaine Reagan, was the idea of coming up with a summary of trustee duties and responsibilities that could be given to a potential candidate for the board or the appointing power before they even get on the board. And this, I think, was born of painful past experience that several of us had had regarding someone getting on the board and then realizing, for whatever reason, it wasn't for them. Either it was too much of a time commitment, or, wow, I didn't realize I have to fill out the statement of economic interests, or, whatever reason, or, geez, I don't like this idea of personal liability. I don't think I want to play anymore. There's several things that you would like members, potential board members, to know about what it means to be a board member before they actually get on the board. And this document, which is in one of the appendices to the report, is an effort to, if systems adopt it, to have trustees come in with eyes wide open once they assume their board membership. We had an extensive discussion in the report of Toni at the top and its effect and its importance to the effectiveness of systems ethics policies. Bottom line is this, and I hate to go back to Enron. Enron had, wonderful governance policies, but lousy Toni at the top, and it really just takes one bad apple to totally mess things up. One of the things that, in the committee's view, a governance structure can accomplish is basically create a structure so that it's much harder for bad intended people to do bad things, and if they try to do them, provide a means for someone to identify and report them. We'll get to undue influence in a minute, but I think that's one of the really significant areas. We covered a number of areas with respect to conflicts of interest. And then you can see the list there. It's a lot. Conflicts of interest is probably by volume the largest section in the report. I wish it didn't have to be, but that unfortunately is kind of how it is right now. And we think we did a pretty good comprehensive job. The focus of the committee was to bring together the applicable bodies of laws and rules into one place, provide one-stop shopping. It's really easy for a board member, or anyone for that matter, any public official, to feel completely overwhelmed by the number of different conflicts of interest laws, disclosure requirements, and other provisions that are out there. I can speak specifically to California. There's probably about a half dozen laws, other rules, and system policies. So we want to at least provide summaries of those provisions in one place that a trustee can refer to, and then provide a means to fill in gaps in the law with policy language to do that. An example of that is no contact laws. Most jurisdictions have laws in the books that say that if you have an RFP going, you can't talk, a potential bidder can't talk to anybody at the system, or they can only talk to one specified individual at the system. Well, there are a lot of things that can happen before you get to an RFP, or where there's not going to be an RFP and a procurement through some other means, where you can have communications that are designed to influence the outcome of the proceedings that aren't subject to that ban. For example, communications between board members and third parties seeking system business outside of a formal RFP, communications between board members and staff, which can range. I did a presentation on undue influence for the National Association of Public Pension Plan Attorneys last year, and the examples were everything from a board member who got a call from someone saying they had an interesting proposal and the board member just passes along without comment, to the other extreme of, I've got this interesting proposal from so-and-so, and if you don't do this, you're going to have a problem at your next compensation committee, next compensation review. And there's obviously different striations between those two extremes. That last one would be obviously an attempt to exert undue influence. So one thing that the policies do is attempt to identify what constitutes undue influence, as opposed to communications that may be designed to inform or influence but not threaten, and then provide a means, if those communications cross the line, for the individual who's the target of that communication to report to an appropriate higher-up so that it's investigated and vetted appropriately. Another gap in many laws is the fact that there is no legal requirement, at least in California for a long time, requiring the disclosure of placement agent relationships. And as I alluded to earlier, in 2006, 2007, CalSTRS adopted a policy explicitly requiring that if a money manager was using a placement agent, that fact had to be disclosed, and the amount of the fees received by the placement agent for placing a transaction also has to be disclosed, and that's reported publicly by CalSTRS. CalPERS did not have such a policy in place at the time that Mr. Villalobos and Mr. Bren-Rustro were operating at CalPERS, and underlying all of the stuff that has happened, the $11 million investigation, state and federal civil suits and a federal indictment, as well as California laws coming in after the fact to require all placement agents to require as lobbyists. Underlying all of that was an original situation that likely, I think, would have been mitigated had there been disclosure provisions in place at CalPERS before any of this happened. So that's in essence what we've covered in the report. In terms of next steps, the most immediate one is trying to get the word out, which is what we're doing today. And then again, we'll have this presentation available online. And then we've talked very preliminarily about potential future work of the committee in areas such as risk management, internal controls, and compliance, because we've moved from framework to core governance policies and recommended language. But there's obviously a lot of other structure that a system has to have in place, not the least of which is to ensure that you have the structure in place, are you complying with it, that we think requires further work, and we may embark upon that at some point in the future. And with that, if there aren't any other questions, Ann.
The tone at the top issue. So how does a board, and I go back to say the PERS example because of the personal experience, what do you recommend that board members do to make sure the tone set by their executive is the proper one? Because that was one where the executive sort of ran off the rails.
Sort of.
Well, without going into too much detail, one could argue that the executive in some instances was aided and abetted by one or more board members. Well, I can say, and this is, I think purely hypothetical. I don't think I've been confronted by this. Oh, actually, I have. The answer is you need to. If you know something is going on, if you're a board member, you need to talk to some of your other board members and/or your CEO and start developing a strategy to because you can't, change the individual that's intended on doing badly, but you can isolate them, and it can be if you do it right, you can find a way to isolate it. And in one situation, one long ago situation that I can think of, that's exactly what happened. One board member was really pushing a transaction hard, and there were all kinds of things that were potentially wrong about that transaction. And it became obvious to a handful of other trustees, and they spoke up. They just said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? So that's the best case scenario. And sometimes, depending upon the circumstances, you have to be subtle. I mean, it's really kind of a case-by-case thing. The important thing is you can't let it go. Again, this is not a fiduciary presentation per se, but there are principles of co-fiduciary liability and lots of other things that come into play if you're facing / aware of that kind of situation.
Risk and compliance next, because I really do think once this foundation's in place, and Washington has a history of, a 20-year history of trying to actually effectively putting good governance in place, but then the risk culture, the risk-aware culture that has to be created both with staff and the board, and a compliance culture and the compliance system are just so critical to maintaining that going forward. Well, so I'm glad you're thinking of doing some work on it. That'd be great.
And I'm only hesitant because it's really challenging, and it's challenging for at least two reasons that come to the top of my head. The first is that it's really, as hard as it is to get to this point with respect to policies, it's even harder to start talking to people about compliance. And second, the champions of compliance are auditors, and they're lovely people, but they are not the most persuasive individuals in the world. So it's really hard to, and there are some that are very good at this. And, again, it's one of these things where, we can help identify language, we can help identify processes and procedures, but one point I'd like to make, in my experience, these things have not happened at systems without at least one or more board champions. You've got to have that impetus. If a CEO comes in more often than not and says, we got to do this, then it's not going to get very far likely unless one or two board members pick that up. That was definitely the case at CalSTRS. I mean, a lot of this happened because, and I wish Mark Batty was here, he was a member of the original Clapman committee and also the 2.0 committee. And we were at a CalSTRS offsite talking about pay-to-play issues. Mark at that time was a representative of the then state controller. And it was almost the fact that, it's sort of Nixon goes to China, that the fact that an ex officio representative talked so strongly about the need for these kind of policies, and that was followed up when Ann was at CalSTRS representing the Department of Finance, bringing, that piece of it to the table as well. So it's very hard to get anywhere unless you have that championship at the board level. We're way over, okay, try to do one more. Are we okay for a few more minutes? Okay, that's what I make sure. Go ahead. As a practical matter, common sense and experience. If I added up the experience of the members of the Clapman 2.0 committee, and I can do this, it's Rich Kopis is out of the room, but it was several hundred years of experience working with these systems that was reflected in the room. And that gives us, gave us a real advantage because we'd all been doing this, so we had a sense as to what would work, it would not work. I found, I alluded this to earlier, I have found that like economic analyses of system governance, at least at this point in the development, maybe 10 years from now it'll be different. At this point, I don't find them to be very helpful in determining which policies work and which policies don't. Any other questions? All right, thanks much. Thanks, everybody.